Clara Whitfield stepped down from the rattling stagecoach with careful steps, clutching the small leather suitcase that held nearly everything she owned. The dusty street of Silver Creek, Montana, stretched before her, lined with wooden storefronts, hitching posts, and curious faces that turned to study the newcomer. After weeks of travel from St. Louis, her legs felt weak, but her heart was full of hope. She had come west to marry a man she had never met, a rancher who had answered her advertisement for a mail-order bride. In his letters he had sounded kind and dependable, promising a simple life and a home where she would be welcome. Clara's journey had not been easy. She had sold most of her belongings back home to afford the trip and carried only a few dresses, a small Bible from her mother, and a faded photograph of her childhood home. Her family had passed away years before, leaving her alone in the world, and the opportunity to start a new life in the American West had seemed like a blessing. The rancher's letters had spoken of wide fields, clear skies, and a quiet life away from crowded cities. Clara had imagined a small wooden house, a garden full of vegetables, and evenings spent watching the sunset with the man who would become her husband. A tall man stood near the general store. Glancing toward the stagecoach, as it pulled away, Clara recognized him from the description in his letters, Thomas Caldwell. The man who had invited her to Silver Creek. He wore a fine hat, polished boots, and a coat that suggested he cared a great deal about appearances. Clara straightened her simple dress and walked toward him, trying to hide her nervousness. When she introduced herself softly, Thomas looked her up and down with a slow, disappointed expression that made her stomach tighten with unease. For a long moment, he said nothing. His eyes paused on the worn edges of her suitcase and the plain fabric of her dress, which had faded during the long journey west. The hopeful smile on Clara's face began to fade as his expression hardened. Finally, Thomas sighed and rubbed his chin, clearly dissatisfied. He had expected someone different, someone who looked wealthier, more refined, perhaps someone who could impress the townspeople of Silver Creek. Clara sensed the shift immediately. The warmth in his letters suddenly replaced by cold judgment. Thomas spoke quietly, but not quietly enough. A few men sitting outside the saloon heard him as he muttered that he had expected a woman who looked presentable, not someone who appeared to have nothing to her name. Clara felt the words strike her like a sharp wind across the prairie. She tried to explain that she had traveled far, and that her belongings were modest because she had spent her savings reaching Montana. But Thomas shook his head impatiently, clearly embarrassed by her presence. Within minutes, the promise that had carried Clara across the country collapsed in front of the entire town. Thomas declared that the arrangement would not work, and that he had changed his mind. Without offering help, or even a moment of kindness, he turned away and walked back toward the general store, leaving Clara standing alone in the dusty street. The townspeople pretended not to stare, but their whispers filled the air. Some shook their heads in sympathy, while others simply watched the humiliation unfold like an unexpected show. Clara stood frozen for a moment, trying to understand how quickly everything had gone wrong. She had imagined arriving in Silver Creek and beginning a new chapter of her life. Instead, she felt as though the ground beneath her had disappeared. The suitcase in her hand suddenly felt heavier than ever before. She slowly walked toward the wooden bench near the train depot, hoping to find a quiet place to gather her thoughts away from the curious eyes of strangers. Sitting there, Clara watched the dust drift across the empty tracks and tried to calm the storm of emotions rising inside her chest. She felt embarrassed, hurt, and uncertain about what to do next. She had little money left, and the next train east would not arrive for days. Returning to St. Louis seemed impossible without help. For the first time since she had begun the journey, Clara wondered if she had made a terrible mistake by trusting the promise of a man she had never truly known. Across the street, a quiet figure had witnessed the entire scene. Jacob Turner stood beside a wagon loaded with feed sacks outside the supply store. He was a broad-shouldered rancher in his early 30s, known in Silver Creek as a hard-working but solitary man. Jacob spoke little, kept mostly to himself, and spent most of his days tending cattle on the large ranch he owned several miles outside town. Life had made him cautious with people, and he rarely involved himself in the affairs of others. But something about the young woman sitting alone near the depot caught his attention. He had seen the rejection happen and felt a sharp sense of injustice settle in his chest. Clara had not argued or shouted when she was humiliated. She had simply accepted the cruelty with quiet dignity, which impressed him more than any show of anger could have. Jacob watched her for a few minutes, noticing the way she held her head high despite the disappointment written across her face. Jacob knew what loneliness looked like. Since the death of his parents years earlier, the ranch house had grown painfully silent. His days were filled with hard work, and his nights were spent alone with the distant sounds of coyotes and the wind moving through the grasslands. He had never considered seeking a wife through letters the way some ranchers did, but watching Clara sit there reminded him how empty life could become when no one shared it. Still, approaching a stranger did not come easily to him. Jacob leaned against the wagon wheel, debating whether he should mind his own business. The townspeople had already begun to return to their routines, as if the uncomfortable moment had never happened. Yet Clara remained on the bench, staring at the ground with quiet determination, as though she refused to cry where anyone might see her tears. After several minutes, Jacob made up his mind. He walked across the street slowly, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. Clara noticed him approaching and straightened slightly, unsure whether he intended to speak with her or simply pass by. When he stopped a few feet away, he removed his hat politely, revealing sun-browned features and thoughtful gray eyes that seemed far kinder than the ones she had faced earlier that afternoon. Jacob cleared his throat awkwardly before speaking. He told her he had seen what happened and asked if she needed help. His voice was calm and gentle, lacking the judgment she had felt from others. Clara hesitated at first, unsure whether she could trust another stranger so soon after being rejected. But there was sincerity in Jacob's expression that made it difficult. To doubt his intentions, she explained that she had traveled from St. Louis expecting to marry Thomas Caldwell and that she had nowhere else to go. Jacob listened carefully, nodding slowly as she spoke. When she finished, he glanced toward the fading afternoon sun and then back at her. Silver Creek, he knew, was not the kind of place where a woman alone could easily find safety or work overnight. For a moment, Jacob remained silent, weighing his words. Finally, he offered a simple suggestion. He told Clara that his ranch was a few miles outside town and that he had a spare room in his house. She could stay there until she figured out her next step. There was no pressure, he explained, and she would be free to leave whenever she wished. He only wanted to make sure she had a safe place to rest after such a difficult journey. Clara studied his face carefully, searching for signs of deception or pity. What she saw instead was quiet honesty. Jacob did not seem like a man trying to impress anyone. He looked like someone who simply believed helping another person was the right thing to do. The offer surprised her, especially after the cold rejection she had experienced only an hour earlier. The sky above, Silver Creek, had begun to glow with the warm colors of sunset. Clara realized she could not spend the night alone at the depot, and she had no other friends or family in the territory. Taking a deep breath, she thanked Jacob for his kindness and agreed to ride with him to the ranch. It was not the life she had imagined when she left St. Louis, but at that moment it felt like the only path forward. Jacob nodded once and helped load her small suitcase into the back of his wagon. As the horses began to move along the dirt road leading away from town, Clara glanced back at Silver Creek. The buildings grew smaller in the distance, and the whispers of the townspeople faded behind them. She did not know what awaited her at Jacob Turner's ranch, but for the first time since stepping off the stagecoach, she felt a small spark of hope returning. The open plains stretched endlessly ahead, glowing gold beneath the evening sky. Clara held the edge of the wagon seat and allowed the cool wind to brush against her face. Somewhere beyond the rolling hills lay a quiet ranch and a man who had offered kindness without asking for anything in return. She could not know that this unexpected moment would mark the beginning of a completely different story than the one she had planned. Clara Whitfield stepped carefully down from the stagecoach as it rolled to a stop in the small frontier town of Silver Creek, Montana. Dust swirled through the warm afternoon air, clinging to her worn shoes and the hem of her simple dress. The journey from St. Louis had taken weeks, and every mile had carried both excitement and uncertainty. She held tightly to the small leather suitcase that contained everything she owned. Inside were a few dresses, a family Bible, and a bundle of letters from the man she had come west to marry. Those letters had promised a new life. Silver Creek looked exactly like the towns Clara had imagined while reading about the American West. Wooden buildings lined the dirt road, and horses stood tied to hitching posts outside the saloon and the general store. A blacksmith hammered metal nearby, the sharp ringing sound echoing across the street. Several townspeople paused in their daily routines to glance at the stagecoach passenger stepping down with quiet determination. Clara felt their curious eyes on her, but she tried to remain calm, reminding herself that this was the place where her new life would begin. For months, she had exchanged letters with Thomas Caldwell, a rancher who lived just outside town. In his letters, he had described his property, his horses, and the peaceful rhythm of ranch life. He had written about long evenings watching the sunset across the plains and how lonely the ranch house could feel without someone to share it with. Clara had believed those words completely. After losing her parents and living alone for years, she had longed for a place where she belonged. When Thomas suggested marriage through correspondence, she had seen it as a chance for a fresh start. Clara scanned the street, nervously, until she noticed a tall man standing outside the general store. His coat was neatly pressed, and his boots shone as if he had polished them that very morning. He held a letter in one hand and looked toward the stagecoach with expectation. Clara recognized him instantly from the photograph he had once sent. Her heart beat faster as she walked toward him, each step carrying the weight of hope and fear. When she finally reached him, she greeted him softly and introduced herself. Thomas Caldwell's smile appeared at first, but it faded almost as quickly as it had come. His eyes moved slowly over Clara's appearance, from her simple dress to the scuffed leather suitcase she held in both hands. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably. Clara felt her excitement slowly slipping away as his expression changed from polite curiosity to obvious disappointment. She tried to explain that the journey had been long and that travel dust had ruined her clothes, but Thomas's reaction grew colder by the second. He had clearly expected someone different. Perhaps in his imagination, the woman arriving from St. Louis would wear fine dresses and carry elegant luggage. Clara could see the calculation happening behind his eyes as he judged her appearance. A few men sitting outside the saloon began whispering among themselves, noticing the tension in the street. The warm welcome Clara had imagined was nowhere to be found. Instead, the air felt heavy with embarrassment. Thomas finally spoke in a quiet but sharp voice. He said he had assumed his future wife would arrive looking more respectable. His gaze lingered on her worn suitcase as if it represented everything he disliked about the situation. Clara felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, but she tried to remain calm. She explained that she had used most of her savings to travel west and that she planned to build a new life once she arrived. Her voice was steady, though her heart felt like it was breaking. Thomas shook his head slowly, clearly irritated by the attention the situation was beginning to attract. He muttered that the arrangement would not work after all. The word struck Clara harder than she expected. The promise that had carried her thousands of miles collapsed in a single moment. Without offering help or apology, Thomas turned away and walked back toward the general store. His decision was final, and he did not bother to look back. For a few seconds, Clara stood frozen in the middle of the street, unable to move. The townspeople quickly pretended to return to their business, though many still watched from the corners of their eyes. The humiliation cut deep, but Clara refused to cry in front of strangers. She adjusted her grip on the suitcase and walked slowly toward the small wooden bench near the train depot. Each step felt heavier than the last. The depot stood at the edge of town where the railroad tracks stretched across the open land like to thin ribbons of steel. Clara sat on the bench and stared at the empty horizon. The wind moved softly across the prairie, carrying the faint smell of dry grass and distant cattle. Just hours earlier, she had believed she was beginning a new chapter of her life. Now she felt completely alone in a place where she knew no one. She opened her suitcase and carefully touched the bundle of letters Thomas had written during the past year. His handwriting filled the pages with promises of companionship and partnership. Reading them now felt like staring at a stranger's words. Clara folded the letters again and placed them back in the suitcase, unsure whether she should keep them or throw them away. Her future suddenly felt uncertain in a way she had never imagined. Across the street, a man had quietly witnessed the entire scene. Jacob Turner stood beside a wagon loaded with sacks of grain outside the supply store. He was a rancher who lived several miles beyond Silver Creek. Most townspeople knew him as a hard-working but reserved man who rarely spoke unless necessary. Jacob preferred the quiet company of horses and cattle to the noise of crowded streets. Yet the moment he saw Clara being rejected so cruelly, something inside him refused to ignore it. Jacob had lived most of his life alone on his family's ranch. After his parents passed away years earlier, the large ranch house had grown silent and empty. His days were filled with work from sunrise to sunset, leaving little time to think about companionship. Still, watching Clara sit alone at the depot stirred a feeling he had not experienced in a long time. There was something about her quiet strength that caught his attention. He noticed how she held her head high, even after the humiliation she had just faced. Many people would have shouted or begged for another chance, but Clara had done neither. She had simply walked away with dignity. Jacob respected that kind of resilience. For several minutes he leaned against his wagon wheel, debating whether he should interfere. Approaching strangers was never easy for him, but leaving her alone felt even worse. Finally, he removed his hat and crossed the street toward the depot. Clara looked up when she heard the steady sound of boots approaching across the wooden platform. Jacob stopped a short distance away and greeted her politely. His voice was calm and gentle, carrying none of the judgment she had experienced earlier. He admitted that he had seen what happened and asked if she needed help. Clara hesitated before answering. Trusting another stranger felt difficult after what she had just endured. Yet there was sincerity in Jacob's eyes that made it hard to doubt his intentions. She explained that she had traveled from St. Louis, expecting to marry Thomas Caldwell, and now had nowhere to go. Her voice remained steady, though the exhaustion from her journey showed in her expression. Jacob listened carefully, without interrupting. When she finished speaking, he glanced toward the fading afternoon sun and then back at her. The next train would not arrive until the following day, and Silver Creek was not a safe place for a woman to spend the night alone. After a moment of thought, Jacob made a simple offer. He told Clara that his ranch was a few miles outside town and that he had a spare room she could use. He explained that she was welcome to stay there until she decided what to do next. There would be no expectations or obligations. He simply did not feel right leaving her alone after everything she had been through. Clara studied his face carefully, searching for signs of pity or hidden motives. Instead, she saw only quiet honesty and kindness. The sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the prairie with warm shades of orange and gold. Clara realized she had little choice but to accept help if it was offered sincerely. After a long moment of consideration, she nodded and thanked him. Jacob lifted her suitcase and placed it gently into the back of his wagon. As the horses began pulling the wagon away from Silver Creek, Clara glanced back at the small town where her hopes had nearly been crushed. The buildings slowly disappeared behind them as the open prairie stretched endlessly ahead, though she did not know what the future held. The kindness of a quiet rancher had given her something she thought she had lost that afternoon: hope.